For my first case study, what I'd like to do is show you the process of editing an image in Lightroom from start to finish. And I already pre-selected an image that I'd like to edit. But before I get there, let me first show you the process of picking an image or potential candidate for editing. Now, we already showed you the process of culling before, and my intention here is not to go through that same process. In fact, I already have some images here that I marked with stars that identify the potential candidates. But as I go through the process, sometimes there might be multiple images that might be very similar. And how do I pick which particular one to edit is what I want to show you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And I already have images right here. As you can see, these are the images from a California trip that I had last year. And I'm working with my current catalog. So this is my real environment and this is how I edit images. So as you can see, I have a bunch of images that I already marked as 5 stars or 4 stars, and some of these are already processed, others need to be processed. And what I did is I picked one image right here for post-processing, and this is the one that I'm going to work on today. But before we get there, let's just go through these 2 images right here. As you can see, they're somewhat similar, but you might end up in a situation where you have an image and you're wondering, what can I get out of it? Now, one thing to keep in mind is that as I take pictures out in the field, I always pay very close attention to how I expose my images. And as we've covered in our photography level 1 camera basics course, you do have to pay quite a bit of attention in the field as you take pictures, looking at things like histogram and maybe even the blinkies on the back of your camera, because those things will help you pre-visualize what the end result is going to be in post-processing. And that's exactly what happens to me in the field. If I take a picture and it's something that I really like, it really excites me because I already know what to expect out of it. So if I'm able to capture the beautiful glowing sky or a beautiful sunset, sunrise situation, or anything that looks really good, just by looking at the back of the camera, I can already understand what I can get out of it. And this is something that I do not want to get into in detail, but just wanted to let you know. So as you see me working through the images, you might be wondering, well, how does he do that? How does he even know what to expect out of the image? And this is something that, as I said, I pre-visualize. I see it before I even post-process it. And let me jump into this image and show you what I have in mind. So first of all, we've got these 2 candidates right here. And this first one is, if I go into this image, you can see that the top of the mountain is a little bit overexposed. But if I were to look at and go back and look at this image, this is a very different image where, as I was capturing it, I saw some color. So going back to this, why would it be something that I would not want to post-process is something that I want to talk about here. Because what happened is, as I was taking a picture, this particular picture, I realized that I had to expose to the right, as far to the right as possible in the histogram without blowing out the highlights. And yet, as I did that, this particular camera that I was shooting with did not do a very good job at that. So I had to go back and forth and adjust my settings to be able to get there. But what I want to show you is, if I were to look at this particular image and see, can I even work with it? Is this something that I can consider for post-processing? There are a few things that I normally do. So first of all, I look at this histogram right here. And as you can see, the top right side is blown out. And if I move the mouse over here, you can see the areas of the image that are blown out. This is something that Lightroom is showing me right away. And one thing that I do is, in a case like this, sometimes things can be recoverable even with a histogram showing a little bit to the right. But if you were to take this exposure slider and bring it all the way down to the left side, what you will see is areas that are blown out might appear gray like this. So the areas that Lightroom was showing me earlier, and these are the same areas, they are gray, which means that there is no data in it. And if I hover my mouse over here and you look at this area right here, you can see that those values are exactly the same. So that's a pretty good indication of information that is completely lost. And this is something that I will not be able to recover. So as you work through the images, before I even jump into Lightroom and start identifying the candidate, I will already have a pretty good idea just by looking at the image like this and looking at the histogram of the things that I can recover. So what you can play with is these 2 sliders right here, exposure and highlights. And these 2 sliders should give you a pretty good idea about what you can or cannot recover. So in this particular case, I know that sky is not something I can recover, so I'm not even going to bother with editing this image. But the second candidate right here looks very different. And if you pay attention to this histogram, I do have some highlights on the right side, but none of them seem to be blown out. So if I go to the develop module by pressing the D button, as you can see, as I start moving this exposure slider to the left, I don't have anything that's blown out. In fact, this is a pretty good indication for me to see what I can recover. And as you can see, there's plenty of color in the sky, which is very, very important. And if I bring this back and work with the highlights, I can kind of get there too. And as you can see, that's a pretty good indication of my potential to recover all of these areas. And that's something very important. Sure, you could say, what is the problem of having some gray sky? In some images, you might have very bright clouds and you're photographing in midday, and those are really beautiful patchy clouds. If you lose detail in those bright areas, it might not be such a big deal. But for a situation like this, where there's color in the sky, I cannot simply afford to lose information there, because what I'm going to be able to get out of Lightroom is just gray color. So in this particular case, I know this is a very good candidate for further editing. So let's go ahead and start over. What I'm going to do is go back to my import right here. So we're starting over and go through the process of editing. Now, since this particular image is something that I want to be able to work with in Lightroom from start to finish and never carry it out to any external software, there are going to be things that I'm going to pay close attention to. So if I had this image with a lot of objects that I wanted to get rid of, perhaps it would be a candidate for editing in Photoshop. But in this particular case, as I looked at the details of the image, there's really nothing in here that stands out that needs further serious post-processing. I can, in fact, do most of the editing in this image without ever leaving Lightroom. And that's one thing is, when I edit images, I try to stay within Lightroom and not try to go into external software, because the moment you do that and you make changes to the image in external software like Photoshop and you save the image, it becomes a TIFF file, which you cannot go back and revert and make changes to. Whereas in Lightroom, this is a raw file and I can go back and readjust my edits, completely change the look of an image without having any impact on the image itself. It's non-destructive software, as we said before. So what I'm going to do is, as before, I told you, I always start from the bottom of Lightroom. On the right hand side here, we've got the camera calibration. And the reason why I start on the bottom is because this particular setting has a very important change to the image. In fact, it's one of the few that actually drastically changes the look of images in Lightroom. And if you're going to start from top to bottom, you're going to find yourself making all these changes and seeing what the image is supposed to look like. And then you get here and you click on a different profile and all of a sudden it looks completely different. So what I like doing in the beginning is going through the process of finding the right camera profile that becomes kind of my foundation, and I start building up on it. So let's go ahead and do that. As I come here to the profile, as you can see, these are the specific settings for Canon. As you go through this list, you'll find that I have a bunch of these different camera profiles, including some of these ones below. Now, the ones that actually apply to this particular camera, which I shot with a Canon 7D Mark II, are the ones that say camera faithful all the way to camera standard. If you don't see some of these, or if yours looks completely different, don't worry, because this is very camera specific. In fact, Nikon doesn't have a camera faithful profile, period. So as I toggle through these, you will see how the image here is going to change on the main screen, but the default one that will always be there is Adobe Standard. And unless you follow my guide, which I provided earlier, by creating an import preset which automatically sets a specific profile, it's always going to be by default Adobe Standard. So let's go ahead and go through these real quick and see what the image is going to look like with the different camera profiles. So I'm going to start with faithful. And faithful, as you can see, it made a slight change. And as I go through these, you'll see that quite a bit of change in the image. So landscape, for example, is usually a pretty aggressive one. I rarely ever go into the camera landscape. seems like the landscape profiles across all the different camera manufacturers try to push all the colors and saturate them as much as possible. So that's not something I like doing. Neutral is something that when you pick that camera profile can actually make it look a bit bland, but it also depends by camera. So in this case, it's actually not too bad. Let's take a look at portrait, and the last one is camera standard. Now, which one do I normally pick? I normally pick camera standard. Whether I shoot Nikon or Canon, I find that those are the ones that are pretty solid starting points. So in this case, before I do this though, let's take a look at this area right here because it's overblown and I'm clearly losing that information, at least by looking at it. I know it's there, but I want to recover some of it and see what the camera profile is actually going to do to the image. So I'm going to push my highlights all the way to the left and maybe just tweak the exposure by 1/3 of a stop, let's say. 0.3 minus, and as you can see now, we can see a lot of this information here already, and the highlights are more or less recovered. And this is going to make it easier to select the camera profile. So earlier I was toggling between these and I found Faithful to actually do a pretty decent job with colors. And as you can see, we saw a pretty big boost in this area. So between the camera Faithful and camera Standard, Standard is more bland, it's a lot less saturated. My idea here with this image is to try to bring back as much color as possible and potentially add a little bit of color to the image to create drama. So in this case, I'm more interested in the highlight areas being beautifully lit and being red in this case. So as long as I have that pink, and as you can see on the bottom right here, where I have the reflection, there's a lot more color here than on the top. So I'm gonna try to get there to increase the color saturation. By going to Faithful, as you can see, it's actually a pretty good starting point. So that's what I'm gonna do. Another thing that I typically do to images is play with the blue primary here. Now, this is something that I discovered by just pure experimentation as I was working through these different camera profiles and seeing how it's going to work for my images. I tried these red primary, the green primary, and the blue primary. And remember, these are specifically for the camera calibration submodule of the develop module. And the specific reason for their existence is that if you have a camera profile that you created, or perhaps you're starting with Adobe standard profile, if there are specific colors that you might not like, you might want to go and adjust those. Or perhaps you have a test target that has specific colors that you want to try to match. And those are the 3 settings that you can play with to be able to change the look of these 3 color channels. Now, what I found out was as I was working through the images, this particular one called Blue Primary is something that has a pretty drastic effect on the overall look of the image. And this particularly applies to landscape images. Don't try to do this with portraits or other images because the Blue Primary is something that will affect the blues. Now, with landscape images, what do we have most of the time? We have a situation, whether it's a sunset or a sunrise situation or photographing midday, there's typically going to be color in the sky. Blue color is the typical color you see. So by boosting the blues, you're automatically boosting the color of the sky. And what happens in here is that I've seen saturation slider actually affecting not just the blues, but all the colors. And let me show you how that looks like. So if I take the saturation slider and start moving it to the right, pay attention to what happens to the overall image. Now in this case, I set it to +100, and this is something I would never recommend to anyone because it's way too aggressive. All the blues have changed drastically. In fact, if I look at this area in particular right here, it has actually impacted the color of the rock in that shadow area, and this is something I obviously do not like. But if we look at the before and after, I can come over here, and if I set it to 0, you can see how much of a change this represents. So if I toggle between the two by pressing Command Z or Control Z on a PC, if I toggle between the two, it's a pretty drastic change of colors. So this is something to keep in mind. This slider in here, saturation, doesn't just impact the blue primary by itself, it actually does change all the colors. So pay attention to the sky one more time. As you can see, even the colors in the sky right here have been impacted. And that's why I find this setting in particular to be quite effective for a lot of the landscape shots. You might want to add a little bit to add that additional pop. And in this particular case, what I want to do, whenever you photograph clouds with the sky, you do not want to blend the clouds together with the sky. So if sky has a little bit of that blue color, which is beautiful, you do not want to make the image in the top portion of the frame to look very similar. So in this particular case, if I don't do the separation of the blues, I might end up with a very bland image that has the sky that is more or less even in color. In this case, I know that there is quite a bit of blue, so I want to keep that isolated. So let's go ahead and set it to something like +30 and see the difference. I'm gonna go ahead and set it back to 0 and then undo and redo so that you can see what it's doing to the image. Now, it's very subtle, but it's noticeable enough. And remember, I haven't really done anything to the image at this point. All I'm doing is really playing with two settings here: the camera profile, which I set to camera faithful, and then the blue primary, which for saturation, I set it to +30. So that's what I do. I normally never touch the green and the red primaries. Let's go ahead and move up now. And as I move up, I've got the vignetting here, which at this point, I don't want to touch anything like that. But I want to show you a couple of things about this particular image that are very problematic. And as I was photographing with the Canon camera in the field, I actually shot with a lens that turned out to be a pretty bad lens in a number of ways. And as you can see here, you can clearly see huge problems in the corners. So here we've got two problems. First of all, it looks like the lens was either decentered severely or it has some sort of astigmatism that was causing just crazy blur in the corners. And if I go back and look in the center right here, it's pretty sharp. So this is a problem with this particular lens, and it might be the lens design itself or the sample of the lens that I had, but at the end of the day, I ended up with this image. And it's kind of disappointing when you photograph and you see problems like this. So when I identify an issue, I try to resolve it in Lightroom, and what I can do here is I can actually take care of the chromatic aberration. And that's what I want to show you next, because I want to take care of the image problems before I start taking care of the overall look of the image. And if I can address these issues and call the image still workable after I address the issues, then I can proceed with further editing. But if the image is bad and there's nothing that I can do about it, perhaps it's a good idea to move on to something different. So let's in this case try to address this particular problem of chromatic aberration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on remove chromatic aberration, and as you can see, it actually did a very good job here. By looking at the top, if I toggle this on and off, that's a pretty drastic change right there. There was a lot of green and blue chromatic aberration here on the left side, a lot of orange and red, and by just clicking that, as you can see, it actually addressed most of the problems. Now, I still don't like this. There's a little bit of orange left here. And if I wanted to correct that, one thing that I could do is go into the manual tab here, and I can click on this eyedropper tool. And by hovering over the problematic areas, which here I just don't like that orange in here, and I'm gonna go ahead and click that area. As you can see, that actually did a pretty decent job. Now, I don't really have any orange chromatic aberration issues in the top left side of the image. And at this point, if I were to look at the rest of the image, I know that the issues are taken care of. So this is something to keep in mind. It's a pretty useful setting to go through. Now, one more thing that I want to do is see if there's going to be any change in the profile corrections. By enabling this, as you can see, it actually did change the way that the image appears. And this is something that varies from image to image. In some cases, it might work pretty well, and in other cases, I actually absolutely hate the way that the corrections work here. So if I enable this, you can see it actually does a pretty decent job with correcting the distortion, but it's definitely not doing a very good job with correcting the vignetting. And that's another thing. When I work with images, if some lenses have beautiful vignetting, if I shoot with a lens like 85mm 1.4G, Nikon, or a few other lenses out there that have this beautiful natural vignette to them, I normally don't apply vignetting corrections at all to images, because that's kind of what I bought the lens for, and these corrections can be rather aggressive. So I either can go ahead and switch back to manual and adjust corrections by myself, or in here under vignetting, I can actually tone it down and kind of bring it back to 0. So if we enable the profile corrections one more time, I fix distortion, but I'm not touching vignetting. So let's go ahead and now move up. These are the two that I wanted to show you. And now what I want to do is move up to the top and see what we can do with the image in terms of recovering highlights and boosting the shadows and adjusting contrast. So let's go ahead and scroll up all the way to the basic submodule, because that's the very first thing you see in the develop module. So here we've got white balance, and that's typically where I start. And the reason why is because if I see severe color issues, like if I'm looking at the shadows and I see a lot of blues, you might want to adjust the white balance first, because that will drastically affect the way the image looks, just like the camera profile. So what I'm going to do is, usually what I'll do is I'll start with S shot and then I'll try auto, because with auto setting, Lightroom is going to try to guess what the correct white balance is. In this case, it actually did a pretty decent job, because I don't see a lot of the shadow areas in blue color anymore. So this might actually work pretty well. But in other cases, you will find auto to be rather aggressive. It might make images too orange or too blue. So do experiment with this a little bit. Sometimes you can use this picker tool to select a neutral area. In this case, there's just not a neutral area that I can safely select. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip that. But toggling between the S shot and auto, I can see this is a bit too blue for my taste, especially in the shadow areas here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with auto, and I think this is a bit too orange for my taste. So I'm going to go ahead and actually tone it a little bit down. So maybe just towards the blues, right around there. Now let's go ahead and move down to exposure and all these different sliders. So where do I start and what is my starting point in here? In this particular image, there are certain things that I want to do to it. For example, here in the shadow areas, I do want to bring that shadow area a little bit out, maybe recover the shadows just a little bit more to make them look brighter, and at the same time add a little bit more contrast, because there's quite a few detail happening here. There are also different colors right here. As you can see, there are a bit of oranges here. There's oranges on the right side. There's a really big variety of colors in this particular image. So I want to retain that and maybe even give it a slight boost. Another thing I want to do is just increase a little bit of more contrast, just because I want this image to pop a bit more. So let's work on those first. And as far as exposure is concerned, I already actually recovered the highlights to -100. And as you can see, that actually did a pretty good job right here. And exposure of -0.3 seems to be pretty good. Now, if I go ahead and set it back to 0, it actually brightens up the entire image, including the shadows, but it's also making this particular area a bit too bright. So I'm going to go ahead and tone that back down to -0.3. And the next thing is contrast right here. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out is contrast is something that I personally practically never touch, because it can be pretty aggressive. And what it does, it just adds so much more contrast to the entire image that it doesn't look very pleasant, especially when you push it way too high. So my personal recommendation is I actually don't use this slider, but if I am done with all these other adjustments that I do to the image, every once in a while, if they're not enough, I can come back to that slider and maybe increase it by maybe +10, something like that. I rarely ever go beyond 10, 15 in value. So I'm not gonna touch this for now, and we might come back to it and see later, but at this point, I'm gonna set it to 0. Now, one thing that I do want to do is in this particular area right here, where the shadows are, remember, you can just move your mouse to these different areas and it will show you what slider is going to affect them. So in this case, if I move down here, you can see these are the blacks, these are the shadows, and the shadow areas here are all of these dark areas. What I want to do is I want to give them slight boost. So let's go ahead and work with this shadow slider. I'm going to start pushing this to the right, and as you can see, as I push it to the right, that's a bit way too much, and I don't want that much coming out, but right around maybe a setting of 40 or so, it's actually not looking bad. The next thing I want to do is work on the whites and blacks. Now, this is something that is a way to boost contrast through these two particular sliders, and John already explained how they work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hold on to the Alt key on the keyboard. As I start moving this to the right, the whole image turned black. And what's happening right now is it's showing me what's actually preserved or blown out. And as I push it more to the right, you will see that the blown out areas start to appear. And this is something that I do not want. I do not want any of that sky to blow out. So I'm going to actually tone it down to the level where this is barely blowing out. In fact, right around the setting of 60, I'm still not blowing it out, but I push the whites as far to the right as I can. So this made the entire image look pretty bright, and if we go back and set it to 0 and undo and redo, you can see that's a huge change to the image. I'm going to go ahead and set it back to 61, and now let's work on these blacks. And I'll show you what I'll do to this a little bit later, but the main thing here is to try to work on the contrast. So the same thing, I'm going to click on Alt and drag this slider with blacks to the left. Now it starts with white, and as I push it towards the left, it starts showing me the areas that are underexposed in this case. So I am going to stop right around maybe 28 or 30. So that's pretty good. Now let's take a look at what happened here. If I go back to my previous step and click on shadows, look at how much change we've got just by adjusting those two sliders, by pushing the whites to the right and the blacks to the left until they reach that threshold. You can see that there's a huge change in contrast. Now, there is one particular thing that I don't like here, which is by adding contrast, and in this case, pretty drastic amount of contrast, I actually did overexpose this area right here. And it's way too bright for my taste. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tone this white slider down a bit until I get to a more comfortable level. So maybe right around 36, 35, right around there is pretty good. Now, if we go back and click on the shadows, I'm still adding quite a bit of contrast, but the whites are not as blown out, or the highlights are not as blown out as before. Now, granted, I'm still adding a bit more to the whites. As you can see, there's now this triangular area, which is a little bit brighter than I prefer it to be, but we'll work on this in a little bit. So at this point, we've got the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks set, and the effect is pretty drastic. If I go back to my last steps on temperature, this is where we started, and this is where we are at right now, which is great. The next thing we've got is presence, and presence is something that a lot of photographers overuse and abuse, and this is very unfortunate because these three sliders can actually do quite a bit of damage to the image. And a lot of times I don't even touch this, but in some particular cases, if I want to do a very drastic look, I can add a little bit of clarity, maybe a little bit of vibrance, and saturation is something that I practically never touch. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what clarity does to this image. If I take this from 0 and push it all the way to 100, as you can see, that's a very ugly look right there, because what it's doing now, it's boosting all these midtones, and everything is so contrasty that it looks fake. And this is something that I obviously do not want. In fact, with the clarity setting, as we said before, you rarely ever want to push it beyond maybe something like +20. So in this particular case, let's go ahead and just increase it to maybe a very subtle value, maybe right around +15 or +20, something like that. So in this case, +15, let's take a look at before and after. So that's what we had before. I'm gonna undo and redo, and as you can see, that's a pretty visible change. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna work on the vibrance. Now vibrance, again, I rarely touch this. In this particular case, my goal is to do one thing, which is to try to keep this top area right here where there are blues, and I can see plenty of blues, pretty separated from the cloud layer. Because if I am able to do that, and as you saw before by adjusting that blue channel under camera calibration, I actually brought back a lot of the blues in the sky, which is very nice. But this vibrance setting can actually help me recover even more of that. And if I'm able to give a clear division between the clouds and the background layer, which in this case is the sky and it's blue, that separation might make the image look a little bit more interesting. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to start moving the slider from the left to the right, and as I push it towards 100, you can see, wow, that's obviously a pretty significant change, not something I would ever do. But take a look at what happened here in the highlights. I've got a lot of the blues here, I've got a lot of the highlights with all that color, and I was able to separate it even more. So I'm going to obviously tone it down, and let's go ahead and just start applying maybe right around at most plus 20. So let's take a look at the before and after. That's before and that's after. So that's not bad. I mean, it's a very subtle change, but it's definitely there. Next, we've got saturation. And as I've pointed out before, this is something that I practically never touch. But let's take a look at what happens as I push it towards the right. And as you can see, it's just boosting everything. And even at plus around 40, 50, this is way too much. You can very quickly get into a big mess just by using the saturation slider. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that and recommend that you rarely ever touch this. There are very few cases when the saturation slider is actually going to do a decent job. And maybe plus 5, plus 10 at most in some cases can work out, but be very careful. The vibrance is a much better slider for most situations, especially when doing things like landscapes. All right, so the next thing we've got here is a tone curve. And the tone curve is very similar to the other settings that I showed you before that can drastically affect the way the image looks. If I go ahead and come here and click on this point curve and select one of these presets like medium contrast, it's just going to add a lot more contrast to the contrast that I already applied through these different sliders. But if you want to adjust specific areas and you already toned some of these up or down, you might want to use this in addition to that to be able to recover either the shadows or the highlights. So in this particular case, what I see is I've got this small area right here. And if you look at the reflection, it's actually looking pretty even here in the reflection. But right here, I've got more of a triangle area that is more, it's not necessarily blown out, but it looks pretty bright. And I want to tone that down. Now remember, what you can do here, this is in addition to the highlights over here. So it's already set to minus 100. But if I grab the highlights and start moving them down, as you will see, this area will start getting recovered. So I can either do it right here from the top of the histogram, or I can come down here to the region area and start moving the highlights. If I move it to the right, look at what happens. I just boosted it way up. And if I move it to the left, I start recovering that area. So what I want to do is I want to start from 0 and let's just move it slightly to the left until that area in particular is more or less recovered. So right around minus 30, let's take a look at the before and after. I'm going to set it back to 0, undo, redo. That did a pretty good job, and I think that's something that I'm actually going to keep here. Now, I'm still not very happy about this particular area, which we might be able to address later, but it did tone down on these highlights right here. So maybe right around minus 30, 32 is going to work. I'm not going to touch anything else because I'm happy with the shadows the way they appear right now. There's plenty of the shadow detail that I want to convey to the viewer. So I think the rest of the stuff is not something I want to play with. But another thing I could do if I identified an area here that I wanted to adjust by using this click point, as we showed before, I can actually boost a particular area with just moving it up and down. So I'm not going to do that. Let's move down. So the next submodule we've got here is HSL color and black and white. And I have no intention to convert this to black and white. And I think the colors are already saturated enough to the level where I might not want to experiment with them. But if I said, well, maybe I want to actually boost a little bit of this and add a little bit more red to it, this is where I do it from. So I'm going to go ahead and either jump here to saturation, or if I click on the saturation tab right here, I can quickly grab that and just select the area of interest in this case, and then just start boosting it up or down. Now, boosting it down or moving it down is actually going to desaturate it. And as you can see, the oranges and the reds have changed. And I obviously have a lot more oranges in that sky than the red. So if I go ahead and move it up, that boosts both. Now that's way too much. And that's something you have to be very careful about. Whenever you deal with these HSL sliders, the more you move them to the right, they become more or less the same thing that the saturation slider on the top does, which it does affect a particular color channel, but it does give an overall boost to that channel, which can be a bit too much. So in this particular case, plus 65, plus 3 is way too aggressive. I don't like that. I'm going to go ahead and tone that down, maybe just right around the setting of 25 or so. So let's take a look at the before and after. I'm going to go ahead and back one step. And now we'll take a look, and it's a very subtle change, as you can see, but some of those reds have definitely improved in saturation. Now, another thing I might want to do is maybe take this blue area and see what we can get out of it. So if I grab this, and then as you can see now is jump to blue on the right side, if I start dragging this up, we can try to see if we can boost more of the blues. And as I reach that plus 50, that's way too aggressive, but it does certainly affect the blues in there. And it's now doing it not only to the top of the image, but also in the reflection. So that's something to keep in mind, as this is a global change. So maybe just something like plus 20 or so, and even then that might be a little bit aggressive. So we'll take a look at it in a second. Let's go ahead and go back to where we were before in highlight tones, and this is where we're at right now with both blue and red saturation increased, and looks like it's a subtle change, but it so far seems pretty good. All right, so here's one thing that I want to do, and as I got to the next section, split toning, I will at some point actually jump back to some of these and work on the highlight area a little bit more, because I have a pretty good idea about what I want to do with the sky and the reflection area here. Next is split toning. Now with split toning, I have the ability to boost saturation either in highlights or the shadows of the image. And since we already made quite a few adjustments, this is actually going to be on top of all of them. So keep this in mind. So you don't want to be adjusting this way too much if you already made so many adjustments to the image and the colors already look very good. You might not want to go and make any adjustments here. In this particular case for the image, I do want to make these reds appear a little bit more red. So let's play with this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set saturation pretty high up, maybe not that high, but right around maybe 60. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the hue slider and I'm going to start moving it to the right. Now my idea is to try to get to the point where the highlights are red, because that's kind of what I want to do, is push the highlights towards the red side. And by moving it all the way to the right, as you can see, I'm in the reds. And the saturation, the image is looking really bad right now, but don't worry, because the saturation is pushed way above what it should be. What I'm going to do now is tone it down. And if I start from 0, this is where we were at, and as I start increasing it, as you can see, it's now adjusting the highlights. Now, if I push it even to 30, that's way too aggressive, and the sky is now looking really fake. And this is something that I did not want from the very beginning. If you remember, I've been trying to keep the blues separate from the cloud layer so that I have this different pop and the image looks really nice. In this particular case, with this much saturation added to the highlights, now the blues disappear and everything becomes pink, which is really, really bad. So what I want to do is just tone it down, start from 0, and maybe just add a little bit. Even plus 9 seems to be a bit aggressive. So let's just keep it maybe right around 5 or 6. I'm just going to set it to 6. It's very subtle, but I have just applied more of that red to the highlights area, and it applies both to the top and the bottom of the image. The shadows, I don't need to worry about boosting those because I have plenty of color right here, and adding more colors and saturation to the shadow area is going to make this image look really fake. So I think I'm pretty good with that. Let's go ahead and turn this off and turn it back on. As you can see, it's a very subtle but very visible change. I certainly did impact the colors here in the sky with the blues, but I think I'm okay with that for now. So let's go ahead and come down to detail. Now, detail is where I actually increase the sharpening of the image, and I can make the image look so much better, especially at its full resolution. If I zoom into the image, especially here, right here in the center, the lens actually did a pretty good job at resolving all of these branches. So there's plenty of information there for me to be able to add the additional layer of sharpening and improve the look of the image. So in this case, all I want to do is push the detail all the way to 100, and with the default setting of 25, that already did quite a few adjustments to the image, making it look much sharper. And I'm going to bring the radius down to 0.5, half a pixel. And then with sharpening, if I start from 0 and just slightly move to the right, as you can see right around the setting of 40, maybe right 45 or so, it's going to add so much more sharpening to the overall image. Now you can't really see it here, but if I go to all these different areas and just move up and down, you can see how much more sharpening we've got in the image. Let's go ahead and turn that off, turn it back on, and that's a pretty drastic change right there. Now, I don't want to be adding a lot more halos or anything like that to the image, so I want to be careful with this amount setting right here as I play with the detail and the radius, because if I go too aggressive, then what will happen is I'm going to start adding all these halos to the trees and especially the mountain range on the top, so I don't want that. Now the next thing I want to do, I'm going to zoom out, and as you can clearly tell, there are areas of interest that I do want to add sharpening to, but there are also plenty of areas in the image that I do not want. Specifically here, I do not want to add sharpening to the sky. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and start moving this mask to the right. And as I do this, this is where we start. This is basically saying no masking at all, apply sharpening to everything. And as I start moving it to the right, the black areas are where sharpening is not going to be applied, and then the white areas is where sharpening is going to get applied. So I'm going to try to push it as much far to the right as possible, but if I go way too much like that, then I'm not really adding sharpening anywhere. So I gotta be careful about that. I think right around 35 or so is pretty good, because if I push it even more, then as you can see, some other areas are now being impacted in the shadows, and that's not what I want to do. So maybe right around 45 or so. So what we just did is we applied sharpening mostly to the shadow areas that actually contain the details, and since the sky is not something that I want to add sharpening to, because all that's going to do is add noise to the sky, the masking of 45 or around so is going to work pretty well. So let's take a look at what we've got below here. Now, noise is not something I have issues with in this case, and as I said before, is something I practically never touch anyway, because Lightroom doesn't have very good selective noise reduction algorithms built in, so I'm not going to touch that. Next, we've got other things like lens corrections, which are already applied and we don't need to worry about them. And transform is something that I skipped earlier, which again, something that we don't have an issue with. If this was an architectural building and it was tilted, maybe I would come back here and play with this, but in this case, it does not apply at all. And vignetting is something that I usually do as a very, very last step. If that's something that I want to add to the image, that becomes my pretty much last step before export, because if I apply it earlier, then it does affect the look of the image. So I'm not going to worry about that right now. So let's take a look at what we've done so far. This is the before and this is the after. So this is where we started, and as you can see, we already made quite a few changes to the image and it already looks pretty decent. Now, let me talk about some of the things that I want to do in addition to all the changes that I've made so far. So these are the things that I've made simply by using all the different exposure sliders and the highlights and the tone curve. All these different things that I've applied to the image are from the sub modules here, but I haven't done anything else to the image, which from this point on is something that I do want to do. So this top section is something that I skipped earlier, and this is something I want to come up to and work with simply because there are a few other things that I want to do to the image. Remember, on the bottom here, I do want to make sure that I highlight this area and make it pop a little bit more so that the viewer can see the beautiful leaves in the water. And then here on the top, I'm still not okay with this being a bit too bright. So I'm going to try to tone it down a little. And the best tool for that is going to be the graduated filter tool. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply graduated filter right from this corner of the frame to this side, and I want to apply that towards the sky over here on the top. So let's go ahead and add the graduated filter here, and I'm going to start with a pretty subtle value of -0.3, which is roughly 1/3 of a stop, and I'm going to start dragging from the top corner right here down to the bottom. And as you can see, I can change the angle as I do this, and right around here is where I want to cut it at maybe this angle right here. Now, when you do this, if you see this redness come up, that means your mask is turned on. If you press O, it will hide the mask, and toggling that back on will reveal the mask. And usually I start with the mask applied because then I can see where I'm actually applying the changes to. So in this particular case, what's happening is the graduated filter is applying this change of -1/3 of a stop to not just the highlight area here, but a lot of the areas right here too. So anywhere where you see the red color is where the effect is getting applied to. So in this case, we're actually touching the mountain here and even the tree line here. And remember, what I did is I started from the top quarter and I dragged it all the way down, which means the area that I'm actually selecting for this transition is very gradual. Let's go ahead and undo this. What I could also do is select a very short area. So if I do something like this, what's happening is, as you can see, all this red is up until this point and then gradually tries to transition. And this is something that is not going to work in many cases, especially when something like this is involved with the mountains. Because if I remove the mask, you can see it has actually darkened this area pretty significantly compared to the bottom side of that same mountain. And I don't like that, so you got to be very careful. I'm going to go ahead and undo, and let's drop a graduated filter with a bigger selection like this. Now, what I'm going to do is turn the mask by pressing the O button. And in this case, I actually want to brush out these areas because the effect of this graduated filter, if I set it to something more aggressive like a -1 stop and hide the mask, you can see that it's actually really aggressive. If I turn on and turn this back off, you can see that all of this area in the mountain range and in the shadows is getting affected. And that's something I certainly do not like. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back to -0.3, and I'm going to jump to brush. So my idea is to take all of this area and paint it out. And I'm going to select erase. And what I want to do is reduce the effect of this graduated filter just to the highlight area right here. By selecting erase, keeping auto mask, and setting the flow, let's just go ahead and set the flow to 100 so that everything here is painted out in one stroke. If I start applying this, look at what's happening to the edges. It's actually not touching the sky, even though I'm actually overlapping it in many areas. So by doing the auto mask, it's actually smart enough to know that I should only be applying this to the mountains and not the sky. But you have to be very careful because this area right here is where your danger zone is. If I start painting it, it's going to get confused. There's too many branches. So what I want to do is maybe start around here and then just paint this area out completely and not touch the tree line here. So I'm going to change the brush size to a bigger brush size and just completely get rid of all that in here. So right around there. Again, got to be careful around that tree line, and the same with the reflections. So I think that's pretty good. Now look at what we just did. The change is obviously happening here. I painted most of the mountain range out, and I could get a little bit more selective by painting this top ridge here, which also got selected. But I'm not going to be super picky right now. Just by pressing the O button, I can see the change. Let's go ahead and reverse that, set it back to 0. This is the before, this is the after, and as you can see, the change is pretty drastic. By darkening the sky, I'm able to not only bring out more details, but also focus the attention more towards the center of the frame, which I do like. But one thing that I haven't really achieved much here is recover some of the highlight areas here. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but this is to give you an idea of what's possible with the graduated filter. Let's go ahead and close that. And the next area that I'm going to work at is the area right here. And as I said before, I do want to bring out the details. And I'm not going to change the exposure on this yet, at least. And let's go ahead and do a similar selection from the bottom of the frame. So I'm just going to drag this maybe right up until this point. As I said before, I want to bring out those leaves and make them pop so that the viewer can see a lot more detail. And the clarity slider here is going to do the job. Now, one thing that it's doing, as you can see, it's actually bringing out the details in that area through that clarity slider, but at the same time, it's actually brightening it up. If I go ahead and undo this and set this back to 0, it's a pretty clear change, and that's way too bright. So if I'm going to play with that clarity slider and push it to a pretty aggressive value, I'm going to have to tone it down in terms of exposure. So let's go ahead and set it to something like 75. Now, I know that's a lot, and I've said before that I usually don't do this, but the idea here is to bring this area out. And unfortunately, the only way that I can achieve this is through the clarity slider getting a pretty aggressive value, but I'm going to tone down the exposure at the same time. So let's set it back to maybe half a stop. So as you saw what that just did, if I go ahead and turn this off and turn it back on, pay attention to the bottom of the image here. And as you can see, that clarity slider did increase the detail, and now we see a lot of the leaves in that area, but at the same time, it didn't do much change to the exposure. So I did darken it just a little bit more. That's actually not too bad. Let's just leave it at that setting for now. But one thing I want to take a close look at before I do that is I want to explore this area just a little bit more, because I do not want this to have too much clarity compared to the top of the image here. So once again, let's go ahead and undo and redo. And that's actually not too bad. I don't think there's too much stuff happening here. At this point, I do have a few additional tweaks that I want to apply to the image. And one of them is to add a little bit more saturation to those red areas in the sky, because I feel like what I saw in the scene was so much more vivid, so much more beautiful than what I see here. And this can be very subjective, because some people actually like the slightly saturated look of the images. Other people like a little bit less, more toned down and subtle look to the images. In my case, I think I want to push it out a little bit more and make it pop, make it like a really visually appealing image. So the way that I do that is I can play with a few different settings in here on the top. I've got this adjustment brush that I can work with and to bring out the color here, but also at the same time, don't forget that if I work on the top, I should not forget the reflection, because if I make changes to the image on the top area and not touch the bottom area, it might look pretty fake. So I got to be very careful about that. In this particular case, what I want to do is I want to start with this area right here. As you can see, this triangular area is still a bit too bright, and I want to tone that down. And the way to do it is, instead of using the graduated filter, which applies to a very large area, granted, I could use the masking and edit out, it would take too much time. The adjustment brush is a very easy tool to use. So what I'm going to do is increase the size of the brush, and the next thing, and again, you can do that through here. The feather is set to roughly 61 and the flow is set to 100. I'm going to actually bring the flow down a little bit, because I do not want this to apply 100%, just a little bit less than that. And I'm going to try to paint this area. So what I'll do is maybe set it to minus 0.2, just a very small change. And let's see what happens if I apply that to this triangular area right here. So by just painting this area, let's take a look. That's actually not bad. If I set to something more aggressive like minus 0.5, that is a bit too much. And as you can see, what it did is it's now adding a little bit of that dirty yellow color to it, and it's getting a little bit darker. So maybe something like minus 0.3 is not too bad. Now let's take a look at the before and after. So this is the before. If I turn that off, and this is the after, and it's a pretty visible change. But if we go back to the image, I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I go back to the image. As you can see, I don't have that triangular shape anymore, and the highlights look fully recovered. So this is not bad. The next thing I want to do is add another layer of adjustment brush, and the purpose of the next one is to bring out the colors a little bit more. So let's work on that. I'm going to go ahead and select the adjustment brush and zoom into the image. Maybe that's a bit too much. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and set this to 1:2 ratio. So that's a pretty good area to work with. Now, what I want to do is just paint all of these red areas with the adjustment brush. So for this, I'm just going to grab my pen real quick and just start applying that. And maybe that brush is just a bit too big. So let's go ahead and set it to a smaller number. And as you can see, I'm just applying that to all these areas right here and just painting these reds. So we'll make changes to it in a second. Just right here, all of these areas just on the highlight side right there. So this is just that area. Now, we had the exposure set to negative 0.2, which is not my intent. In fact, I want to either tone it down, maybe just negative 0.1, a very subtle exposure change so that these don't actually look very different. Two things I actually want to bring out here. One is I want the clouds to appear a little bit separated from the background. And the second thing, I want to saturate them a little bit more. So the first one is I'm going to increase the clarity just a little bit. Now, if I push it all the way to the right, as you can see, doing a little bit of a change because I actually set the flow to about 50, half the value. But as I increase that clarity higher, it's boosting a little bit of these areas. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to apply a little bit of color. Now, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use the slider that I usually don't really work with, which is the saturation slider. And the other option that I've got is to apply selective color from here. So let's try both. I'm going to start with the color, and this is a pretty cool setting because you can navigate through this. And as you can see, as I start changing it, especially moving towards the top, it is going to modify that color a little bit. A very subtle change, but the change is definitely there. So if I wanted to boost the reds and I make it pure red like that, that is not what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and tone that down, bring it down all the way here, and let's see what it does. So that's a little bit too much still. So maybe you're right around 25%. So what we just did is I just added red to the areas that I painted with the adjustment brush. And if we take a look at the before and after, this is what the before was, and this is where we're at right now. So a very subtle change, not too much red. So you got to be very careful as you do this. And I'm going to just continue painting in these areas and applying that setting. So got to be very careful. And if you don't have distinct areas that you can paint on, you have to be very careful because then it will paint over other areas of the image as well. So that is not bad. And one thing is, I'm not sure that I do want the exposure on there. Let's just make it purely clarity and a little bit of color. So let's take a look at the before and after. I'm going to go ahead and press spacebar, click, zoom out, and this is the before, this is the after. As you can see, we have a bit more red over here. This area didn't get much change because it's more orange than red. So I'm going to zoom into this area and just add a little bit more flow. So just decrease the size of the brush. And let's just paint this a little bit more because I do want to bring out more red in this particular area because that's where most of the color is. So let's take a look. If I reveal the mask by pressing the O button, as you can see, these are all the areas that I've touched. And actually one thing that I forgot about is this auto mask. In this case, it wasn't really doing much, but it's probably not a good idea when you're trying to apply it to different areas. So if I remove the auto mask and start painting over, then it will apply to all these different areas. So sometimes I actually keep the mask turned on. That way I can see exactly where things are going and painting over these areas. So again, a very subtle, got to be very careful about how I do this, but these are the areas that contain color in that image. So let's go ahead and turn off the mask by pressing the O button. And this is the before and this is the after. Now, I applied just this color change right here. If I were to take the saturation slider and boost it all the way to the right, as you can see, it's now boosting everything in the colors, but it's also taking this orange and it's making it look really dirty, really oversaturated. So I got to be very careful as I use this saturation slider. So typically, a small value might work, but in this case, I'm just going to reset it back to 0. I think that's enough right there. So let's go ahead and zoom out. And remember, I painted that area on the top. This area on the bottom also has very similar colors, so I should not forget to do that. Now, looking just from here to the bottom, I can see that the top area looks brighter, the bottom area looks darker. That's the way it's supposed to be. But these areas right here, the additional parts of the image that I painted earlier, are quite not there. So I'm going to go ahead and select the same setting. I think it was right around 25% right here. So let's go ahead and set that to 25. I don't need to add clarity because it's already added in here through that previous graduate slider. But what I'm going to do is paint all of those areas in the reflection that have some color so that this looks pretty good. Whoops, the exposure is set to -0.2 for some reason. Let's go ahead and reset that. At this point, I am just purely adding a little bit of color to these areas where I see it. So let's go ahead and do that. Maybe just areas here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when you aggressively use these brush tools, such as the adjustment brush or the spot healing brush, Lightroom can get really slow, and that can be very frustrating. And even if you have the fastest computer out there, it will still slow down to a crawl. So as you make these adjustments, you might want to apply to certain areas, wait a little bit and apply to other areas. Otherwise, you might find every once in a while, it will just paint things by itself. And I've seen that happen a lot. So this is just the computer trying to catch up with everything that's going on. For this reason alone, a lot of photographers prefer taking their images out of Lightroom into Photoshop because you can do all these things so much faster and the brush strokes do not slow down the computer. But in this particular case, I'm not worried about it too much because all I want to do is just bring out some of the areas of the image and this slowdown doesn't bother me too much. So let's go ahead and zoom out. So in this case, let's take a look at the before and after. This is where I started. Pay attention to this particular area right here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on that last setting. And as you can see, there is a slight boost of colors all over here as well. So in fact, here it's actually looking much darker than the top, which is not bad. And remember, the reflection is always going to be darker than the other area. So that's not bad. Let's take a look at the before. This is where we started once again. And that is where we're at right now. And that looks really good at this point. But there are a couple of other things that I want to fix. And one of them is this area right here. Take a look at this corner where the image is for some reason so much darker here compared to this corner. Now I could go to vignetting settings and adjust them, but if I do that, all four corners are going to get adjusted and that's not something I want to do. So a quick fix for that is just to use the graduated filter. And what I'm going to do is just set it to something like plus half a stop. And let's just bring it down from that corner, just like that. Now remember, we still have the color selected, so I need to tone that down, set it back to 0, so we no longer have that. And about half a stop I think is pretty good. Let's see, right around there maybe. Let's go ahead and close that, and that brightened it up pretty good. And this is actually looking very bright as well in the corner, so I'm going to take care of that by dialing half a stop minus, removing the color because we don't need that, and applying that to the bottom of the frame just so that it's not overly bright. In fact, that's actually way too dark. I'm going to set that back down to maybe half or 1/3 of a stop, and that's not looking bad. So that is pretty good. I think I am happy with this result so far. The image looks so much more different than before. So one last thing that I might want to do is just add a little bit more pop to the image by adding more contrast. And this is something that I can apply on the global scale. Remember, we completely skipped over the contrast, so I can either try it here or play with the tone curves a little bit and push them to be able to pop that a little bit more. So let's take a look at what happens with the contrast setting right here. If I start moving to the right, as you can see, it's actually making it look really bad. But a very small change right there, maybe to right around +10, might be something that we might want to keep. So let's take a look at the before and after. I'm going to set this to 0 and then undo, redo. So that's not too bad. And at this point, I think I'm generally happy with what I've done so far to the image. Now let's wrap things up and I'll show you one more time before and after side by side so that you can see where we started and where we ended up. So the most important thing is when you work on images, first, make sure that the image has enough details for you to be able to recover them. If you're photographing a scene and you have colors, even if you have a little bit of color, make sure that you're capturing that color. Because the worst thing that can happen is the scene is beautiful, but you did not capture it and the highlights are blown out, then you have nothing to recover. As long as you have that information in the image, and I showed you how you can start by manipulating your exposure slider and the highlights to see how much information you can recover, then you can decide that's the image that I want to work on. The second part is obviously pre-visualization, understanding what you want out of the image before you start editing it. Because the worst thing that I've seen happen is people start experimenting with all these sliders without really having a clue of what they want to get or the end result that they want to get. And that leads to a lot of frustration because then they try something out and then is this good or is the other edit good? Should I move this slider or that slider? It becomes more of an experimentation. Since I knew exactly what I wanted out of this image before I started editing it, it was very helpful because in my mind, this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted a bit more pop to the image. I wanted more color in the sky, the red and blue separation in the clouds, and everything that I've done to the image is so far something that I actually had in mind. Now, granted, a few other things, maybe vignetting and a few other things I did not plan for, but generally I had a pretty good idea of where I wanted to get to. So keep this in mind as you work through the images, as you gain experience, shoot more and do more, you will get to the point where you will be pretty good at having an idea where you want to start and where you want to end. Now you've seen my editing flow, which is to start on the very bottom of the develop module where the camera profiles are, then select one to have as a foundation that I can build on. And that's what I typically do. And although my typical camera profile that I select is something like camera standard, every once in a while I might change that to something different. In this case, faithful worked pretty well. And in other cases, maybe something like neutral might work better. It varies from image to image, and something to keep in mind, all these edits that I showed you, they're very subjective. These are the things that I saw in my image. However, your interpretation might be different. Perhaps you're going to work with completely different settings and come to a very different image, and that's perfectly fine. Remember, I'm providing you with raw images of all the images that I'm working with in Lightroom and Photoshop, so feel free to fire them up, experiment, and see where you can get to. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at where we got with this image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go back to the grid. So we have only one image here, which is our final edit, and what I want to do is I want to show the before and after side by side. And the way to do that, if you remember, we can just right click and then click create virtual copy, and that creates another copy with the settings here. I'm going to go ahead and right click the original image and go ahead and reset all the develop stuff that we've done to it. Now I can hold shift, select both images and press the N key on the keyboard, then hit tab to hide everything we've got on the sidebar. This image right here on the left is before we started editing the image, and the image on the right is our final edit. And as you can see, it's a pretty drastic change. We went from a very bland image with very little contrast and a lot of other issues like chromatic aberrations here in the corner. The highlights were nowhere near as good as they look now here, to a very rich image that pops. We have a lot more contrast in the image. The sky's recovered. We painted a lot of these areas so that we can separate the blue from the red in the image. So this is a very drastic change going from here to here. I hope you found this case study useful and learned a thing or two about how I post-process my images in Lightroom. Now in the next section, I'm going to take a completely different image, start in Lightroom, and take it to the next level by post-processing it in Photoshop.